Okay, open up your Bibles to John chapter 1, if you would, please. John chapter 1. Hearing that review from Alex makes me want to go sit in on the teen class. I love studying the apologetics. Good stuff. Glad you guys are learning that. All right, we're going to be taking a look at verses 6 through 13. Before we get into this, I want to give a little bit of background of some of the things that's going on I think would help us understand what the Apostle John is meaning, or maybe give us some insight as to why the baptizer takes on such significance in the story of Jesus. What was it that the Jews were anticipating the most? When you look at their whole lives, what was the one thing they anticipated the most? Okay, an earthly king, which was who? The Messiah. They were anticipating this Messiah. They were always looking for the Messiah to come. And so everyone's told about this in their Saturday school. For the Jews, they didn't come together on Sunday, but they were learning about the Messiah. And so when this John the Baptizer came up on the scene, he created quite the stir. What was the first thing, if you lived down the road from his parents, what would be interesting about the birth of John? Okay, his parents were old. That's right. The situation that occurred with the father, remember when he was doing his priestly duties and he was struck dumb because he wasn't believing wholeheartedly the message from the angel. So the manner in which he was born, that got people's attention. So that, and that miraculous sign after he was born, then the father could speak. And then when he grew up, his manner of dress and his diet were very irregular. What were they? That's right, locust honey, and his dress. Yeah, camel hair. So he did things differently than everyone else. So he's already grabbing the attention of people. This strange little kid, interesting way he was born. And when he began preaching, his messages were much different from the religious leaders. He was preaching about the coming of the kingdom, preaching baptism of repentance. He openly opposed the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He even had a great influence upon the king. People were coming in droves down there to meet him, and they were all being baptized and hearing about the coming of the kingdom. So with that kind of excitement being generated by him, it would be natural for people to wonder, is this the Messiah? You can almost see it when you kind of lay it all out like that, and they're watching all these things occur. And if you were there, if you and I were there, we would probably think the same thing. Is this the Messiah? Could this be him in this person, John the Baptizer? And so we have this brief introduction of him here, and we get more information as we get down to verses 19 and following, but we're just going to look at 6 to 13 tonight. And so John, the apostle who wrote the letter, to him, he wants us to see why this is important, what these things about John, and he wants to make this comparison to him. Remember last week we talked about there at verse 2, where it says, he was in the beginning with God. That is literally, this one was in the beginning with God. And then later on, when you have verse 7, he came verse 8, he was not the light, is literally, that one was not the light. Speaking of John, making a comparison between the two. So when we get down here to verses 6 through 8, the Apostle John wants the people to understand who John the Baptizer was and who Jesus was. There was probably still confusion out there about who exactly John was. Was he the Messiah, or was he one of the prophets? They probably weren't quite sure. So he's going to put all this out for everyone to see so that there's no confusion. So let's read verses 6 through 8. There came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. So he was sent from God. There came a man. That word came there in verse 6. That is literally appeared in the Greek. He appeared, not like miraculously appeared, but he's stating that there was a starting point for this John. He was born. They know this. When he was talking about Jesus, he was in the beginning with God. He always was. So there's the first comparison between the two. So, and John was a man who was sent from God. That word sent comes from the same Greek word where we get apostolos, the apostle. What does the word apostle mean? Messenger. Herald. Okay, herald. One sent. But yeah, I mean, herald's that's going to be the preacher term. But it's one who is sent on a mission. John wasn't preaching? He was preaching, but that's a different term. Sent, apostolos, is one sent on a mission. In this case, he's got a mission. He's going to preach a message. And so that's true. You're right on that. He came for a witness, or verse 7, he came as a witness. What is a witness? One who saw. He knows something, things that God has let him know, things he's seen in Jesus, which he'll be getting into that later on, verses 19 and following. And he's going to testify about the light. Or maybe your translation says, bear witness. And so he's going to give some credible information. The entire career of John is set forth in that statement, that he is there to testify of the light. And so the apostle, writing this letter, he keeps reminding us of how a person comes to faith. It only comes with credible evidence, doesn't it? That's what faith is based on. When evidence is presented to our minds and we accept the truthfulness of what that evidence is. And that's what John was doing. He was providing evidence. He had been preaching. People had been listening to him. Later on, he'll say, behold, the Lamb of God, as he sees Jesus coming. And the disciples of John will see Jesus, and the first two leave and begin to follow Jesus. A lot of the disciples of Jesus came from John the Baptizer, his disciples, because he had been pointing the way, or making known the way of the Lord, of Christ. And so he came to testify. He was a witness of these things. And in verse 8, let me hit that last part of verse 7. So that he came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. That's through John the Baptizer. He wanted everyone to believe through the words he was speaking. And they did. He was bringing in thousands of people. Everyone was coming to hear what he had to say. And of course, they even thought he was the Christ, although he constantly denied that. Now, verses 9 and following, we have a response here to the word. Verse 9, there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. So let's go back there to verse 9. So the Word who was with God is that true light that came into the world, enlightens every man. The word true here means to be real, or that which is genuine. John the Baptizer was more of a reflector of who Christ was. He wasn't the real deal. Jesus was. It goes back to what we were saying before about the sun and the moon. John the Baptizer is the moon. Jesus is the sun. He was just there to reflect the message of the things of Christ and to point out the reality of what was to come in the person of Jesus. So, of course, the sense that light can light up a path and show us the way to the Father. That's what Jesus is going to do. John could not do that. He could only point out the light to us, but he could not show the way to the Father. And you would think that when this light came into the world, all men would come welcoming it with open arms. When the Creator of all things came and set foot on our earth and made himself known, you would think we would just accept that and be overjoyed by that. Was it not obvious that Jesus was the Son of God? Would you say, after reading through the Gospels all this time in your lifetime, was it obvious that Jesus was the Christ? Huh?
Starting at Cana.
Yeah, it was obvious. No doubt about it. He even made references to that about himself and backed it up with miracles. So why wouldn't they believe it? Now, it's not what they were looking for. Despite all the miracles, they would just turn the other way and pretend they did not see it, despite all the credible evidence that was building up about who he was. And so you have this reaction to the word. And the truth is, Jesus was not readily accepted by everyone. And John, the apostle, expresses three responses, very distinct responses, at starting here with verse 10. He, Jesus, was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. So you got this macro look. He was in the world, but the world did not know him. And then he tightens that down a little bit further when he says in verse 11, he came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. That first word, he came to his own, that's domain. You could say the people. And then over in the word other own is more specific to the people. But it's domain first. He came to his domain, his chosen people. And then they even did not know him. And they were looking for him. They were looking for him. And then we get down to verse 12. But as many as received him, who are they? A little bit in the world and a little bit from his own. But they're all individuals who made individual choices. Name a few people who broke ranks with their group and believed the word of Jesus. Cornelius, okay, yeah, over in the book of Acts. Nicodemus, that's what I was thinking of. We're going to run into him here in just a little bit in chapter 4. Nicodemus definitely, how did he first come to Jesus, you remember? By night. He was a little nervous because he knew how people would react to Jesus. But he still broke ranks. So you can see how people will react to him. It was all on an individual basis rather than the Jews decided or the Gentiles or the Romans. It was people making their own decisions based on what? Credible evidence. Credible evidence that was presented to them. There was no denying it. Oh, okay. Well, yes. But no one mentioned that one, and I'm pressed for time. So, as many as received him, that's those who are individually making a choice, to them he gave the right to become children of God. To them he gave the right, or he gave authority, or the power. In other words, so God gave it to them, Jesus gave it to them. Well, God gave it to them, but they didn't have it before. They didn't have the right before. They didn't have the power or the authority to do this before. And what was it that he gave them? What was the right he gave? To become children of God. Now, what does that mean? Yeah. They become part of the family. And they become owned by God. Jesus is constantly referred to as the Son of God. So he is the Son to God. There is a relationship on the same level. We are never mentioned that way in the book of John. He always calls us the children of God. So it's going from God out to us rather than the Son to the Father, as is with Christ. We only have that relationship because of what is given to us. In other words, we have no power to make this happen. None. And only those who believe Jesus get the right, receive that ability, that power, that authority to become children. So in other words, it was never in ourselves to make it happen. It had to be given to us. That's what John is saying here in this verse. So there's faith, but that faith is based on credible evidence. And then when we believe and we are acting on that, then we are given that power, that ability, that authority to become children of God. Something that we could not do on our own if we had to have Jesus in order for that to happen. To them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. That's who got it. And it's based on faith, an obedient faith. verse 13. Who, still talking about those who received it, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And John is going to come back to this concept of being born. So the word has to get in you. It produces in you life, and then you are born into a new life. And we know where that's going over there in chapter 4. We'll get to that then. But in this verse, he's making, again, a comparison between those of the Jews and those of who make that individual choice. What did the Jews think? Did they think they were children of God or that they were not children of God? They were. When anyone ever said that, oh, you are slaves of Rome or slaves of sin, how would they respond? We've never been enslaved. And what was, and even Jesus told them once, if God wanted, he could raise up what to be children? Rocks. What point do you think he was trying to get to them? Yeah, that's right. You're nothing. You don't understand it. Something new is coming. And in the Word, a new process. And you are going to be born into a relationship with the Lord, but it's a spiritual birth. And John's going to make that even more clear in chapter 4. He's already introducing it here. But it's a birth that is not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. All three of those have to do with procreation, about being born into an actual family. The blood there, let me have it written down here, make sure I say it just right. May have received him. I think I keep up with this. The blood is the one's physical descent, the will of the flesh, the carnal desire, nor the will of man. And the word man there is speaking of the husband there in the Greek. So it is that urge to procreate. It is to have children, to keep the line going. And so he's telling the Jews, it's not going to happen that way. This is not how you come into a relationship with God. It happens different, and he's going to show them that over in chapter 4. But of God, who were born of God. And how were they born of God? Well, they were given the right. He gave it to them, put it into them, their minds, into their hearts, a new spirit, and that was found in the person of Christ. And so John is clearly stating this birth is of God, spiritual, not physical. It follows our understanding of what's involved in birth. You first need to be conceived, and then you must be brought forth in delivery before you can be part of any family that you're born into. And in like manner, we must be spiritually conceived by God. And that happens when we believe in the Word he sent to us. Something spiritual happened in our minds and our hearts, but a spiritual conception alone does not bring us into God's family. We have to be delivered. We have to be born again. And John, again, like I said, he's going to show us that conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus. I said chapter 4, it's chapter 3. And that occurs at the baptism. And so you can already see how he's setting these things up. He wants his readers to see some things. Number one, he explains who John the Baptizer was and who Jesus was. Jesus is the Messiah. And from here, he's going to keep building up on that idea and then show where those relationships begin before he gets into that long description of those last few weeks of his life. But these are what he sees as the most important. And isn't it? Did you realize that the first few chapters of John shows here's how a person gets into a relationship with God the Father? Because that's what we're looking for. The Jews were looking for the Messiah. He says, he's here. He was not John. He's Jesus. Here's how you get into that relationship with the Father in Jesus. And here's why that happened. And then he shows Jesus going to the cross and being raised again. Great, great gospel. A lot being said in just a few chapters, but I hope we get the time to look at each and every one of these as we work through this. Any comments or questions on that? I know I kind of went through that pretty quick, but